In the winter of 1898, the mining settlement of Bitter Ridge lay buried beneath 6 feet of snow, its wooden buildings barely visible against the towering peaks that seemed to swallow sound itself. The air carried the metallic bite of coming storms and the distant echo of mine blasts that had fallen silent weeks before. It was a place where men vanished into the earth as regularly as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, where whispered prayers mingled with the scent of pine smoke, and where the trusted butchers, Elias and Agatha Galloway, had fed the community for nearly a decade. But when Sheriff Josiah Hale broke down the door to their homestead that December morning, he discovered a kitchen that would haunt his dreams until his dying day. The scene was not one of random violence or desperate hunger. It was the aftermath of a feast, meticulously prepared and carefully consumed. 2 sets of adult remains lay butchered with surgical precision, the meat stripped clean, the bones arranged with an almost ritualistic care. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe, because the story I am about to tell goes beyond anything you can imagine, into a darkness that challenges everything we think we know about the bonds between parent and child. What investigators found in that frozen kitchen was not the end of the Galloway family, but the final act of a horror that had been feeding in the shadows for years. This was not just murder, this was a feast that had been planned since the moment 3 small hearts began beating in the darkness beneath their home. It was Jeremiah Pike who first noticed the silence. As the company store clerk, he made weekly deliveries to the isolated homesteads scattered throughout Bitter Ridge, and the Galloway place had never been quiet. There was always the sound of Elias sharpening his blades, the rhythmic thump of Agatha's sewing machine, the crackle of their ever-burning hearth. But on that December morning, the house sat like a tomb against the white mountainside. When Pike knocked and received no answer, unease settled in his stomach like a stone. The Galloways were creatures of habit, predictable as the sunrise. Elias would be preparing the morning's meat. Agatha would be mending clothes by the window. The silence was wrong. It was absolute. Sheriff Josiah Hale arrived within the hour, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air as he circled the homestead. The windows were fogged with condensation, suggesting warmth within, yet no smoke rose from the chimney. Doc Murdoch, the town's aging coroner, followed close behind, his medical bag clutched against his chest, like armor against whatever they might find. The front door was unlocked. This detail would haunt Pike for the rest of his days. The simple, trusting unlocked door in a wilderness where men bolted everything against the mountain's hungry darkness. Hale pushed it open with the barrel of his rifle, and the smell hit them like a physical blow. It was not the clean scent of butchered game they expected from the Galloway kitchen. This was something older, richer, nauseating in its familiarity, yet impossible to place. The metallic tang of blood hung heavy in the air, mingling with the sickly, sweet aroma of meat that had been cooked slowly, carefully, with attention to seasoning and preparation. The kitchen told a story that defied immediate comprehension. The large iron pot still sat on the stove, its contents long since consumed, but residue clung to the sides like evidence of some unspeakable stew. 3 wooden bowls sat at the table, scraped clean, arranged with the precision of a family meal. The chairs were pushed back at odd angles, as if the diners had risen suddenly, perhaps in satisfaction, perhaps in haste. But it was the butcher's block that drew their horrified attention. 2 sets of human remains lay arranged with professional precision, the meat stripped away with surgical care, the bones cleaned and organized by size and type. The cuts were too clean, too purposeful for violence. This was craftsmanship. Elias Galloway's tools hung in their usual places on the wall, each blade gleaming and sharp, recently cleaned and oiled with the care of a master craftsman. His apron hung on its peg, stained but neat. Everything suggested routine, normalcy, the careful maintenance of a trade practiced daily for years. Doc Murdoch knelt beside the remains, his weathered hands shaking as he began his preliminary examination. The bones showed no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no indication of a fight. The precision of the butchering suggested knowledge, experience, an understanding of anatomy that went far beyond desperation or madness. But the size of the pot on the stove and the number of bowls set at the table suggested more than two had sat down to eat. Bitter Ridge was not a place men chose to live, but a place where the desperate came to disappear. Carved into the shadow of the Galloway peaks, a range so treacherous that even the indigenous tribes had avoided its higher elevations, the mining settlement existed at the mercy of forces beyond human control. The silver veins that drew men to this desolate corner of the territory ran deep beneath granite and schist, requiring them to burrow ever deeper into the earth's belly. The settlement itself consisted of no more than 30 wooden structures clustered around the company store and the mine's operations. In winter, the passes closed completely, sealing the community off from the outside world for months at a time. Supply wagons could reach them only during the brief summer thaw, leaving the residents dependent on each other for survival through the long, hungry months when the mountain wore its crown of snow. The Galloway homestead sat apart from this fragile cluster of civilization, positioned deliberately at the mouth of a narrow canyon that led deeper into the peaks. Elias had chosen the location carefully when he and Agatha arrived in 1890, claiming he needed proximity to the natural icehouse formed by the canyon's perpetual shade. The cold, he said, was essential for his trade as the community's butcher and meat preserver. From the settlement, the homestead appeared as little more than a dark speck against the white mountainside, smoke rising from its chimney like a thin prayer against the vastness. The path that led to their door was treacherous in good weather, nearly impassable when the snows came early. This isolation was both blessing and curse, providing privacy but also creating a buffer zone where strange sounds could be dismissed as wind, where odd smells could be attributed to the mountain's own mysterious exhalations. The people of Bitter Ridge had developed a peculiar relationship with death. Mining accidents claimed lives with seasonal regularity, men simply vanishing into the earth through cave-ins, explosions, or equipment failures. The mountain, they said, demanded its tribute, and they had learned to accept these losses as the price of silver. Bodies were not always recoverable from the deeper shafts, and families learned to hold memorial services over empty graves. This acceptance of loss, this resignation to the mountain's hunger, created an atmosphere where questions went unasked and irregularities were absorbed into the fabric of daily survival. When Silas, the mine foreman, reported that 3 men had been lost in the spring collapse of 1892, their bodies irretrievable from the flooded shaft, the community grieved and moved on. When similar incidents occurred with disturbing frequency over the following years, the pattern was attributed to the mountain's particular malevolence, not human intervention. The company store's ledger books, meticulously maintained by Jeremiah Pike, told the story of a community's commerce in stark columns of figures: flour, coffee, lamp oil, blasting powder, tools, fabric, medicine, the mundane necessities of frontier life, recorded with the precision of a man who understood that accurate records might mean the difference between survival and starvation when the supply wagons finally arrived. But certain entries in those ledgers would later seem unusual, even suspicious. The massive quantities of salt and vinegar purchased by Elias Galloway, far exceeding what any family might need for normal food preservation. The timing of these purchases, always following the mine's major accidents by mere days. The consistency of the pattern, repeated year after year with clockwork precision, in a place where men vanished into the earth weekly, Where the mountain's appetite for human lives was accepted as natural law, who would notice if a few extra pounds of meat came down from the Galloway place? Elias and Agatha Galloway arrived in Bitter Ridge during the autumn of 1890, traveling by wagon from parts unknown with little more than a collection of gleaming butcher's tools and a story that explained nothing while seeming to explain everything. Elias spoke of losing their farm to drought in the territories further south, of seeking a fresh start where a man's skills with meat and preservation might prove valuable. Agatha remained largely silent during those early weeks, her pale eyes holding a sadness that the community attributed to recent losses. They were not young when they arrived. Elias perhaps 45, with graying temples and the thick hands of a man accustomed to heavy work. Agatha a few years younger, but worn in the way that frontier women aged rapidly under the weight of hardship and isolation. Their marriage appeared solid, built on the quiet understanding of couples who had weathered storms together, though neighbors noted they rarely displayed the casual affection common among longtime partners. Within weeks of their arrival, Elias had established himself as essential to the community's survival. His knowledge of butchering and meat preservation was exceptional, far beyond what most frontier settlements could expect. He could transform a tough old deer into tender steaks, cure bacon that would last through the harshest winter, render fat into soap and candles that burned clean and long. More importantly, he volunteered to manage the community's ice house, using the natural cold of the canyon to preserve meat for the entire settlement. The townspeople came to depend on the Galloways in ways that went beyond mere commerce. Elias provided not just meat, but security. The confidence that protein would be available through the long months when hunting became impossible and supply wagons could not reach them. His prices were fair, his work reliable, his manner respectful toward both the miners and their families. Agatha proved equally valuable to the community, though in quieter ways. She was a skilled seamstress who could repair work clothes with invisible stitches, fashion warm garments from salvaged fabric, and create the small decorative items that made frontier life bearable. Her needle was steady, her patterns precise, her prices modest. She attended church services regularly, sitting in the back pew with her hands folded and her head bowed in prayer. Yet for all their usefulness, the Galloways remained apart from the social fabric of Bitter Ridge. They attended community gatherings but did not linger for conversation. They were courteous but never warm, helpful but never intimate. When asked about their past, they provided details that satisfied curiosity, without revealing anything meaningful about who they had been before arriving at this remote outpost. The community's women occasionally speculated about Agatha's obvious sadness, attributing it to the childlessness that seemed to define the couple's private sorrow. In a place where large families were both blessing and necessity, where children meant survival and continuity, the Galloways' empty house felt tragic. Some whispered that Agatha had suffered losses, perhaps children who died young or were never born at all. This perceived tragedy made the couple objects of gentle pity rather than suspicion. Their reclusiveness was understood as grief, their silence as the natural reserve of people who had endured more than their share of life's cruelties. The community protected them in small ways, asking no probing questions, making no demands for social intimacy they seemed unable to provide. Elias's management of the ice house gave him access to every piece of meat that passed through the settlement, every carcass that required preservation, every cut that needed proper aging. His expertise made him the final authority on what was suitable for consumption and what should be discarded. His word on matters of meat and preservation was absolute, unquestioned by a community that trusted him with their very survival. But their reclusiveness wasn't grief over lost children or the natural reserve of private people adjusting to a new community. It was the meticulous management of a hidden larder that required constant attention, careful planning, and absolute secrecy. The first sign that something was amiss at the Galloway homestead came in the winter of 1895, though it would be years before anyone recognized it as a warning. Jeremiah Pike had been making his weekly delivery of supplies, fighting through knee-deep snow to reach the isolated canyon where the couple had built their life. Pike had developed a sense of duty toward the Galloways that bordered on devotion. He arrived that December afternoon to find Elias unusually agitated, pacing in front of the house like a man wrestling with some invisible demon. The normally composed butcher's hands shook as he helped unload the supplies, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the bitter cold. When Pike asked if everything was well, Elias brushed off the concern with a forced smile and an excuse about difficult work. But as they carried the goods toward the house, a sound drifted up from beneath their feet that made both men freeze. It was rhythmic, persistent, like someone scraping metal against stone in a steady, almost musical pattern. The sound seemed to come from directly below the kitchen, from what Pike assumed must be the root cellar. Pike paused to listen more carefully, but Elias immediately grabbed his arm and steered him toward the door, with a grip that left bruises. The sound continued for several more seconds, a methodical scraping that suggested purposeful work rather than random settling. Then it stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only uncomfortable silence. Inside the house, Agatha sat by the window with her sewing, but her hands lay idle in her lap, and her eyes held a nervous alertness at odds with her usual melancholy composure. She nodded politely at Pike but said nothing, her gaze repeatedly drifting toward a heavy wooden door fitted with an unusually large iron bolt, the kind used on barn doors, not interior rooms. As Pike set down the final crate, the scraping sound resumed, fainter now but unmistakably coming from behind that bolted door. This time it was accompanied by something else, a soft, rhythmic tapping that sounded disturbingly like small fingers drumming against wood. Elias moved quickly to the door and slid the bolt home with a sharp metallic clang that echoed through the house. The sounds stopped immediately. The visit ended abruptly when Elias announced urgent business in the ice house. He ushered Pike toward the front door with barely concealed impatience, pressing payment into his hands and making vague promises about larger orders. Pike found himself standing in the snow outside the closed door, listening to the sound of the bolt sliding home behind him. Mrs. Martha Gable, whose homestead sat closest to the Galloways, though still nearly a mile away, had her own stories to tell. On windy nights, when the mountain's voice carried sound strangely, she claimed to hear music drifting from the Galloway place, not hymns one might expect from a devout couple, but children's songs sung in high, thin voices that seemed to dance on the wind like spirits. When pressed for details, Mrs. Gable would describe nursery rhymes, simple melodies that any mother might sing to soothe a restless child. But there was something wrong with the songs, she insisted, something off-key and unsettling that made her close her windows and pull her curtains tight against the mountain darkness. The sounds were written off by those few who heard the stories, attributed to wind patterns in the canyon or the mountain's own mysterious voice, but they were the first cries of a hunger that could not be silenced, the earliest warnings of an appetite that had been growing in the darkness for years. The bond between Jeremiah Pike and the Galloways had been forged in blood and desperation during the brutal winter of 1893, when a late-season blizzard caught Pike between settlements with no shelter and failing light. He had been delivering emergency medical supplies when the storm descended like a living thing, turning familiar mountain paths into a maze of white death. Pike's horse stumbled in a hidden ravine, throwing him into a snowbank that might have become his grave. The cold seeped through his clothes with ruthless efficiency, and within minutes he could no longer feel his hands or feet. The wind howled through the canyon with a voice that seemed to mock his predicament. It was Elias Galloway who found him, appearing through the swirling snow like some frontier angel of mercy. The butcher had been checking trap lines when he spotted Pike's horse, wandering riderless through the drifts. Following the animal's trail, he discovered Pike half buried and barely conscious, his lips blue and breathing shallow. Elias carried Pike to the homestead with surprising strength, cradling the smaller man like a child. Inside the warm kitchen, Agatha worked with quiet efficiency to strip away Pike's frozen clothes and wrap him in heated blankets, while Elias prepared something that would save his life. The meal that revived Pike was unlike anything he had ever tasted. Rich, gamey, with a depth of flavor that seemed to reach into his bones and kindle warmth from within. The meat was tender, falling apart at the touch of a fork, seasoned with herbs that filled the kitchen with an almost intoxicating aroma. Agatha ladled the stew into a bowl with shaking hands, her pale eyes watching Pike's face as he ate with desperate hunger. Within an hour, feeling had returned to his extremities and color had crept back into his cheeks. The Galloways sat quietly while he ate, their presence comforting without being intrusive. Pike felt a gratitude that went beyond mere politeness. From that day forward, Pike felt an obligation to the couple that bordered on the sacred. They had saved his life when they could easily have remained by their warm fire and let the mountain claim another victim. He began leaving extra goods with their orders, small luxuries that the company store rarely stocked, refusing payment despite their protests. It was during these increasingly frequent visits that Pike began to notice patterns in their purchases that seemed unusual for a couple living alone. The quantities of salt and vinegar far exceeded what any household might reasonably need for preserving game. Elias would order these items in bulk, always following mining accidents by mere days. Pike's growing infatuation with Agatha made him hyper-aware of every detail about the couple's life. He noticed how her hands trembled when she handled certain items, how her gaze would dart nervously toward that heavy cellar door whenever he lingered too long in the kitchen. But as the years passed, disturbing questions began to surface in his mind. The timing of Elias's largest orders always seemed to coincide with mining accidents and the loss of workers whose bodies were never recovered. The meal that saved his life now filled him with a nauseating doubt that he tried desperately to suppress. If you're finding this story as disturbing as I am, hit that subscribe button now, because what we're about to uncover will challenge everything you thought you knew about survival and the lengths people will go to protect their darkest secrets. The system that sustained the Galloway family's darkest secret was as methodical as it was monstrous, built on the foundation of tragedy and hidden beneath layers of community trust and frontier necessity. Elias had not simply stumbled into his role as the settlement's meat provider. He had engineered it with the calculating precision of a man who understood that survival often required terrible compromises. When the Galloways arrived in Bitter Ridge, Elias had volunteered to manage the community ice house not out of civic duty, but from recognition of an opportunity. The natural cold of the canyon provided perfect preservation conditions, but more importantly, it gave him control over every piece of meat that passed through the settlement. He became the sole authority on what was fit for consumption and what should be discarded. The mining operation itself provided the raw materials for his grisly trade. Accidents in the deeper shafts were commonplace, and the recovery of bodies from collapsed tunnels or flooded chambers was often impossible. When Silas, the mine foreman, reported 3 workers lost in the spring collapse of 1892, their bodies supposedly trapped beyond reach, no one questioned the official account. The families grieved, the company paid modest death benefits, and life continued. What no one realized was that Elias had volunteered to assist in the recovery efforts, descending into the damaged tunnels with the expertise of a man familiar with both mining and butchery. The bodies he claimed were irretrievable had actually been carefully extracted under cover of darkness and transported to his homestead for processing. The mining company's desire to avoid liability and the family's need for closure created a conspiracy of willful ignorance that served his purposes perfectly. The preservation process itself was elaborate and professional. Using the massive quantities of salt and vinegar that Pike dutifully delivered, Elias could cure human flesh in ways that extended its usability for months. His knowledge of butchery allowed him to break down bodies efficiently, separating choice cuts from waste, rendering fat for cooking, and grinding bones for meal that could be mixed with other feeds. The community's isolation worked in his favor. Supply wagons arrived only seasonally, forcing residents to depend on preserved foods and local hunting for survival through the long winters. When Elias provided additional meat from his own stores, claiming successful hunting expeditions or fortunate trades with passing travelers, no one questioned the source too closely. Protein was precious, and the Galloways were generous neighbors who asked for nothing in return. But the most crucial element of the system was the hidden nursery beneath his kitchen floor. Behind that heavy bolted door, 3 small figures waited in the darkness, raised from birth on a diet that no human child should know. The triplets had never tasted conventional food, never learned to crave the simple pleasures of bread or milk or fresh fruit. They knew only the rich, satisfying sustenance that their father provided, with ritualistic regularity. Agatha's role in this nightmare was more complex than simple compliance. Her skills as a seamstress served practical purposes, creating clothing for the growing children who could never be seen by outsiders. Her presence provided the maternal care necessary to keep the triplets manageable during their early years, but her shaking hands and nervous glances revealed the psychological toll of maintaining such a secret. The children themselves were not prisoners in any conventional sense. They had been conditioned from birth to accept their underground existence as natural, their unusual diet as normal. They knew no other life, had no concept of the world beyond their hidden chamber. Their parents were their entire universe, and they trusted absolutely in the wisdom of the adults who fed and clothed and sang to them in the darkness. The timing of Elias's preservation work followed the mountain's own schedule of destruction. Major accidents provided windfall supplies that could sustain the family for months, while smaller incidents offered supplementary provisions. He learned to anticipate the mine's dangerous periods, understanding which weather conditions and work schedules were most likely to produce casualties. It was a perfect, hellish system that transformed human tragedy into family sustenance, turning the mountain's appetite for miners into a reliable food source for the creatures hidden beneath the Galloway kitchen. The system functioned flawlessly for nearly a decade, until the mountain stopped providing what the growing children required. In the weeks following the discovery at the Galloway homestead, Sheriff Hale found himself overwhelmed by the magnitude of evidence and the complete absence of any living perpetrators to arrest. The case defied conventional investigation, presenting him with a scene of methodical butchery, but no clear understanding of who had wielded the knives or where they might have gone. It was during this period of desperate searching for answers that an unexpected witness emerged from the winter roads. Thomas Whitmore was a traveling tinker who had built his livelihood on the seasonal circuits between remote settlements, carrying his wagon of pots and pans and small luxuries to families starved for contact with the outside world. His arrival in Bitter Ridge came 3 days after the discovery, his usual cheerful demeanor subdued by the rumors that had reached him from other settlements along his route. When Sheriff Hale learned of the Tinker's presence, he immediately requested an interview, hoping that an outsider's perspective might shed light on the mysteries surrounding the Galloway family. What Whitmore revealed would become the first concrete evidence that the homestead had harbored secrets far stranger than anyone had imagined. The Tinker's encounter with Elias Galloway had occurred in late November, approximately 3 weeks before the discovery of the bodies. Whitmore had been traveling the mountain road toward Bitter Ridge when he encountered the butcher walking alone, something unusual in itself given the dangerous nature of the paths and the early onset of winter weather. Elias had appeared agitated when he flagged down the Tinker's wagon, his normally controlled demeanor replaced by a nervous energy that made conversation difficult. He examined Whitmore's wares with an intensity that bordered on desperation, handling items with shaking hands and muttering under his breath in a way that made the experienced trader uncomfortable. What caught Whitmore's attention were 3 identical porcelain dolls nested among his general merchandise, delicate figures with painted faces and elaborate dresses that represented some of his most expensive inventory. These were luxury items intended for the wealthiest families, not the kind of purchase typically made by frontier butchers living in isolation. Elias fixated on the dolls with an almost hypnotic fascination, turning them over in his rough hands and examining every detail of their construction. He asked detailed questions about their durability, whether the paint would fade with handling, how easily the small limbs might break under stress. His questions suggested familiarity with children despite the community's understanding that the Galloways were childless. The negotiation that followed was unlike anything in Whitmore's experience. Elias offered to pay twice the asking price for all 3 dolls, insisting on immediate purchase and refusing to consider any alternatives when the Tinker suggested that such expensive items might be impractical for his circumstances. The butcher's hands shook as he counted out the coins, and his eyes held a haunted quality that made Whitmore eager to complete the transaction and continue on his way. As the Tinker prepared to leave, he made a casual comment about Elias having a large family to require 3 such elaborate gifts. The response was immediate and chilling. Elias's demeanor shifted from nervous to cold in an instant, his grip tightening on the dolls until his knuckles turned white. He stared at Whitmore with eyes that seemed to look through him and spoke in a voice devoid of all warmth. "They have everything they need," he said, the words carrying a finality that discouraged further conversation. The Tinker gathered his reins and urged his horses forward, disturbed by the encounter but unable to articulate exactly what had unsettled him so deeply. When Sheriff Hale pressed for more details, Whitmore recalled other aspects of the meeting that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now took on sinister implications. Elias had been walking from the direction of the mine rather than his homestead, suggesting business there that had nothing to do with his official duties. His clothes had carried a smell that the Tinker initially attributed to his butchering trade, but now recognized as something more unsettling, something that reminded him of medical facilities or morgues. The dolls were a final peace offering, a pathetic attempt to placate a hunger that toys could not satisfy, gifts for children who had grown beyond such simple pleasures and now demanded sustenance of an entirely different nature. The Tinker's testimony convinced Sheriff Hale that the Galloway homestead held secrets that had not yet been uncovered. The evidence of 3 dolls purchased for children who supposedly did not exist, combined with the mysterious sounds reported over the years, pointed toward a hidden presence that investigators had overlooked during their initial examination. Hale returned to the homestead on December 15th, accompanied by Doc Murdoch and 2 deputies. The house stood exactly as they had left it, but now it seemed to watch them with malevolent patience. The sheriff carried a sledgehammer and crowbars, tools that would be necessary if his suspicions about concealed spaces proved correct. Inside the kitchen, the heavy wooden door with its unusual iron bolt drew their immediate attention. Pike had mentioned hearing sounds from behind this barrier, but investigators had initially dismissed it as a standard root cellar. Now, examining the door more carefully, they noticed details that suggested something far more significant. The bolt itself was massive, designed to withstand considerable pressure from within rather than merely securing stored goods. The wood around the hinges showed wear patterns consistent with frequent use, and the floor bore scuff marks indicating heavy traffic. Most telling were scratch marks gouged deep into the wood at child height, desperate scraping that spoke of fingernails clawing for freedom. When Hale finally broke the lock and pulled the door open, the smell that emerged made all four men step backward in revulsion. It was not the clean scent of a food cellar, but something far more disturbing. The air carried traces of unwashed bodies, stale cooking odors, and an underlying sweetness that reminded Doc Murdoch uncomfortably of the morgue. The stairs that led down into the darkness were narrow and steep, carved directly into the mountain's bedrock with crude efficiency. Lantern light revealed rough walls that wept moisture and a ceiling so low that the adults had to duck their heads. This was not a temporary shelter, but a permanent living space, constructed with care and intended for long-term habitation. The chamber at the bottom defied every expectation. Instead of a dungeon or prison cell, they discovered what could only be described as a nursery, furnished with the pathetic care of parents trying to create normalcy in the most abnormal circumstances imaginable. 3 small beds lined one wall, each fitted with carefully mended quilts and pillows that showed years of use. Beside each bed sat a wooden crate serving as a nightstand, holding simple carved toys, pretty stones, and bits of colored glass that caught the light. A larger table dominated the center, its surface scarred by years of meals, with 3 wooden bowls arranged with precise spacing, but it was the walls that truly revealed the horror. Every available surface was covered with scratch marks, not random gouges but deliberate tallies carved with systematic precision. Thousands upon thousands of marks, grouped in clusters of 5, suggesting a counting system maintained over years. The marks began low on the walls at the height of small children, but climbed higher over time. In one corner lay the soiled primer that would later become evidence. The book was battered beyond recognition, but the inside cover bore a single word scratched over and over with desperate intensity. Mama, carved so deeply that it had torn through the paper and scored the wooden floor beneath. The deputies found the remains of the Tinker's dolls scattered throughout the chamber. One lay beside a bed, its porcelain head intact but body twisted beyond recognition. Another had been dismembered completely, its parts arranged in ritualistic patterns. The third sat on the central table, his painted face smashed to fragments, and in the corner a single doll, its porcelain face smashed to pieces. The discovery of the underground nursery transformed the investigation from a simple murder case into something far more complex and disturbing. Sheriff Hale found himself confronting evidence of a systematic operation that had continued for years, but he needed concrete proof to understand the full scope of what the Galloways had accomplished in their isolated canyon. It was Jeremiah Pike who suggested examining the company store's ledger books with fresh eyes, approaching the mundane records of commerce as potential evidence of criminal conspiracy. Pike had maintained these records with meticulous precision for over a decade, recording every transaction with the accuracy of a man who understood that frontier survival depended on careful accounting. On the evening of December 16th, Pike and Sheriff Hale spread the ledger books across the store's counter and began the painstaking process of cross-referencing purchase patterns with the mine's accident reports. What they discovered would provide the mathematical proof of a horror that defied human comprehension. The pattern emerged with devastating clarity once they knew what to look for. Every major mining accident that had claimed lives over the past 8 years corresponded exactly with massive purchases of salt and vinegar by Elias Galloway. The timing was precise, never varying by more than 2 or 3 days between reported deaths and preservation supply orders. The spring collapse of 1892 that had officially claimed 3 workers showed a corresponding purchase of 40 pounds of salt and 12 gallons of vinegar, quantities that far exceeded what any normal household might require for seasonal food preservation. The accident report listed the bodies as irretrievable due to flooding in the collapsed shaft, but the ledger suggested that Elias had acquired preservation materials for exactly 3 adult corpses. Pike's careful records revealed additional details that painted an even more disturbing picture. Elias had also purchased unusual quantities of butcher's paper, cord for binding, and specialized tools for meat processing. These items appeared in the ledger with clockwork regularity following every significant loss of life in the mine's operations. The mathematical correlation was incontrovertible. When they calculated the total amounts of salt and vinegar purchased by Elias over the years and compared them to the number of miners reported dead or missing, the quantities matched with horrifying precision. Each lost life corresponded to approximately 13 pounds of salt and 3 gallons of vinegar, the exact amounts required to properly cure and preserve an adult human body. But the ledger revealed more than just the mechanics of preservation. Pike's records showed that Elias had been a model customer in other respects, purchasing normal household supplies with reasonable regularity: flour, coffee, fabric, lamp oil, ammunition for hunting. The preservation supplies were clearly separate purchases, special orders that served a purpose entirely divorced from the family's ordinary needs. More disturbing still were the seasonal patterns that emerged from the data. Winter months showed the heaviest preservation purchases, coinciding with the mine's most dangerous working conditions and the natural isolation that made body disposal both necessary and possible. Summer months showed minimal such purchases, suggesting that the family had learned to time their activities around the mountain's own schedule of death and concealment. Sheriff Hale found additional corroboration in the mine's own records, which Silas the foreman had maintained with bureaucratic efficiency. The accident reports showed a consistent pattern of body recovery failures, always attributed to flooding, cave-ins, or equipment limitations that made retrieval impossible. But when cross-referenced with the store ledger, every such failure corresponded exactly with Elias's preservation purchases. The most chilling discovery came when they examined the total scope of the operation over its 8-year duration. By conservative estimates based purely on salt and vinegar purchases, the Galloways had processed the remains of at least 26 miners whose deaths had been attributed to mining accidents. 26 men whose families had grieved over empty graves, while their bodies fed the creatures hidden beneath the Galloway kitchen. The evidence was mathematical, undeniable, recorded in Pike's own careful handwriting across hundreds of pages of mundane commercial transactions. Each entry represented not just a purchase, but a life ended and consumed, transformed into sustenance for children who had never known any other form of nutrition. The records showed a grisly harvest that had lasted nearly a decade, a systematic conversion of human tragedy into family survival that operated with the efficiency of any other frontier business. The mountain provided the raw materials, the isolation provided the opportunity, and the community's trust provided the perfect cover for an operation that had fed on death itself. The records showed a business, a grisly harvest, lasting nearly a decade. With the mathematical evidence laid bare before them, Sheriff Hale and Jeremiah Pike could now reconstruct the final horrifying night at the Galloway homestead with chilling accuracy. The physical evidence, witness testimonies, and ledger records combined to paint a picture of desperation, hunger, and violence that had been building toward inevitable catastrophe for months. The winter of 1898 had been unusually quiet in the mines. New safety protocols implemented by the company had dramatically reduced accidents, and the miners who had previously provided the Galloways with their grisly sustenance were working under conditions that made fatal incidents increasingly rare. For the first time in nearly a decade, the mountain had stopped feeding the creatures hidden beneath the kitchen floor. By November, the preserved supplies that had sustained the triplets throughout the previous winter were completely exhausted. The carefully maintained stores of cured meat that Elias had accumulated over years of systematic harvesting were reduced to empty barrels and clean bones. The children, now 9 years old and far larger than the small figures who had once been satisfied with modest portions, faced genuine starvation for the first time in their lives. The evidence suggested that Elias had grown increasingly desperate as the weeks passed without fresh supplies. His purchase of the 3 dolls from the tinker represented a pathetic attempt to distract the children from their growing hunger, to provide them with toys that might somehow substitute for the sustenance their bodies craved. But porcelain faces and cloth dresses could not satisfy appetites that had been shaped by years of unnatural feeding. The scratch marks in the underground chamber told the story of children who had grown beyond their parents' ability to control or contain them. The tallies carved into the walls reached heights that suggested the triplets had grown tall and strong on their horrific diet, their bodies developing with the robust health of creatures who had never lacked for protein. But strength brought defiance, and hunger brought desperation that even parental authority could not suppress. The final confrontation began, according to the physical evidence, in the kitchen above their hidden chamber. The arrangement of furniture, the pattern of blood spatter, and the condition of the remains all suggested a struggle that started with the parents attempting to maintain control and ended with that control being violently overthrown by their own offspring. Agatha's sewing materials were scattered across the kitchen floor, suggesting that she had been working at her usual station when the children broke free from their underground prison. The heavy bolt that had secured their chamber showed fresh damage, indicating that it had been forced open from within by strength that exceeded anything Elias had anticipated when he installed it years earlier. The butcher's tools that Elias had used for so many years to process his grisly harvest became the instruments of his own dismemberment. The precision of the cuts, the professional separation of meat from bone, and the careful arrangement of the remains all bore the hallmarks of his own techniques, learned through years of practice and now turned against him by children who had watched and absorbed every detail of their father's work. The table setting that investigators discovered suggested the final, twisted mockery of family normalcy. 3 bowls arranged with the same precision that had marked every meal in the underground chamber, 3 spoons placed with the careful attention to detail that Agatha had instilled in her hidden children. The triplets had prepared for their last supper in the only way they knew, recreating the ritualistic dining that had defined their entire existence. But the coroner's report would soon reveal that this horrific scene of children consuming their parents was itself a carefully arranged deception, a staged tableau designed to conceal an even darker truth that had been unfolding for years beneath the surface of this mountain nightmare. Doc Murdoch had been conducting autopsies and examining remains for over 30 years, but the evidence spread across his makeshift examination table in the back room of his medical practice presented challenges unlike anything in his experience. The bones recovered from the Galloway kitchen were fragmented, processed with professional efficiency, and sorted in ways that suggested both butchery expertise and deliberate concealment of identifying characteristics. His initial assessment, delivered to Sheriff Hale within days of the discovery, had seemed straightforward despite its horrific implications. Two adult bodies, both processed with surgical precision, both consumed in what appeared to be a final act of desperation by children driven to cannibalism by starvation. The bone fragments, dental evidence, and tissue samples all supported a narrative that was monstrous but comprehensible. But as Doc Murdoch continued his painstaking examination, details began to emerge that challenged his original conclusions. Working late into the winter nights by lamplight, measuring bone fragments with calipers, and comparing dental remains to his own crude records of the settlement's residents, he discovered inconsistencies that would eventually unravel everything investigators thought they understood about the Galloway family's final night. The first troubling discovery came when he attempted to match bone fragments to specific individuals. While he could easily identify remains that belonged to Elias Galloway, matching them to injuries and bone characteristics he had documented during previous medical treatments, the second set of remains presented puzzling contradictions. The bones suggested a woman approximately Agatha's age and build, but certain details simply did not align with his memories of examining her for minor ailments over the years. More disturbing was his discovery of a healed femur fracture among the bone fragments, a break that had mended years earlier and left distinctive scarring on the bone surface. Doc Murdoch clearly remembered treating Elias for exactly such an injury during the winter of 1894, when the butcher had fallen through ice while checking his trap lines. But this particular bone fragment showed additional evidence that made no medical sense. The healed fracture site bore microscopic traces of what appeared to be cooking residue embedded deep within the bone's porous surface in ways that suggested prolonged exposure to heat and seasoning. The bone had been cooked not once but repeatedly over an extended period, indicating that it had been processed as food long before the final carnage in the Galloway kitchen. Doc Murdoch's growing suspicions led him to examine the dental evidence with unprecedented care, comparing tooth fragments to his sketchy records of dental work performed on settlement residents. What he discovered challenged the fundamental assumption that had guided the entire investigation. The dental remains could definitively be matched to only one individual, Elias Galloway. There was no conclusive evidence that Agatha Galloway had died during the final confrontation in the kitchen. In fact, there was no conclusive evidence that Agatha Galloway had been present in the house at all during the massacre that claimed her husband's life. Working backwards from this revelation, Doc Murdoch began to re-examine physical evidence that investigators had initially interpreted as proof of Agatha's presence during the final struggle. The sewing materials scattered across the kitchen floor could have been placed there deliberately. The small garments found in the underground chamber could have been sewn years earlier. The feminine touches throughout the house could have been maintained by Elias himself as part of an elaborate deception. The doctor's final report, completed in the early hours of January morning and delivered to Sheriff Hale with trembling hands, contained conclusions that defied everything the community thought it knew about the Galloway family. Based on bone analysis, dental evidence, and tissue examination, Doc Murdoch could confirm the presence of only one adult victim in the remains recovered from the kitchen. Elias Galloway had been living alone with his 3 children for years, maintaining the fiction of Agatha's continued existence while feeding her remains to the creatures hidden beneath his floor. The woman the community had seen at church services, glimpsed through windows and spoken of in passing conversation, had been nothing more than Elias in feminine clothing, a desperate performance maintained to preserve the illusion of normalcy that protected his terrible secret. The staged scene that investigators had discovered was not the result of children turning on their parents in desperation. It was the final act of a man who had been slowly consumed by his own family for years, a father who had fed his wife to his children and then, when the mountain stopped providing fresh meat, became their final meal, himself. Agatha Galloway had died years ago. The woman in town was a fiction. Elias had been feeding his wife to his daughters all along. The revelation of Doc Murdoch's final report struck the community of Bitter Ridge like a physical blow, shattering their understanding of the family they had trusted and supported for nearly a decade. The horror of children raised on human flesh was difficult enough to comprehend, but the realization that they had been unknowingly complicit in maintaining Elias's elaborate deception pushed many residents to the edge of psychological collapse. Reverend Miller, who had delivered sermons to what he now knew was a murderer in women's clothing, felt his faith shaken to its foundations. The pious woman he had counseled through apparent grief and childlessness had been nothing more than a performance, a mask worn by a man who was systematically feeding human remains to creatures hidden beneath his kitchen floor. The Reverend's diary entry for December 12th captured the community's collective anguish in stark terms. "The devil has come to Bitter Ridge," he wrote in his characteristic flowing script. "The stench of sin hangs over the Galloway place like a miasma from hell itself. We must cleanse this evil from our midst before it corrupts us all. We must burn it all and pray that fire can purify what human wickedness has defiled." Sheriff Hale found himself overwhelmed by the magnitude of the case and the complete absence of any suspects to arrest. The triplets had vanished without a trace, leaving behind no clues to their whereabouts or their ultimate fate. Search parties combed the mountain wilderness for weeks, looking for any sign of the children who had been raised in darkness and fed on horrors. But the winter landscape revealed no secrets. The mining company, faced with the revelation that 26 of their workers had been systematically harvested over nearly a decade, moved quickly to suppress the details and contain the scandal. Company officials arrived from the territorial capital within days of Doc Murdoch's report, bringing with them lawyers, accountants, and a determination to minimize legal liability and public exposure. Silas, the mine foreman whose accident reports had provided cover for Elias's grisly operation, found himself subjected to intense questioning about his role in the systematic concealment of bodies. While investigators could find no evidence that he had been consciously complicit in the murders, his willingness to report bodies as irretrievable without thorough recovery efforts had made the entire operation possible. On December 20th, barely 2 weeks after the initial discovery, the community gathered to watch the Galloway homestead burn. Reverend Miller had organized the destruction as a ritual cleansing, but the fire that consumed the house and its underground chamber served practical purposes as well. The flames destroyed evidence that might have led to uncomfortable questions about community negligence and official incompetence. The blaze burned through the night, fed by the wooden structures and fueled by the collective need to erase a nightmare from their midst. Neighbors stood in the snow and watched years of deception and horror reduced to ash and charred timber. The underground chamber that had housed 3 children for their entire lives collapsed into rubble, its secrets buried beneath tons of stone and debris. Within a month, the official story had been crafted and disseminated. The territorial newspapers reported a tragic case of frontier madness, an isolated family driven to cannibalism by the harsh realities of mountain life. The systematic nature of the operation, the connection to mining accidents, and the true scope of the horror were buried beneath layers of bureaucratic language and deliberate omission. The case was officially closed in February of 1899, filed away in territorial records as a solved matter, requiring no further investigation. The families of the 26 missing miners were never told the truth about their loved ones' fates, and the children who had consumed those remains simply disappeared into the vast wilderness of the mountain peaks. The truth was buried under ash and official silence, but the story refused to die. In the decades that followed the destruction of the Galloway homestead, the mountain wilderness kept its secrets well. The official silence gradually transformed into whispered folklore, campfire stories told by prospectors and hunters who claimed to have encountered something unnatural in the high country. The first reported sighting came in the winter of 1902. A trapper named Joseph McCready emerged from the mountains claiming to have witnessed 3 figures moving through the tree line near dawn, walking upright through snow that would have challenged experienced mountaineers. Their movements too fluid and purposeful to be natural. McCready described the figures as roughly human in size, but wrong in ways he struggled to articulate. They moved without the normal struggle of humans, navigating deep snow, gliding across the surface with efficiency that suggested intimate knowledge of the mountain's hidden paths. When he called out to them, they stopped and turned in unison toward his voice. The faces he glimpsed in the pale morning light would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. They were human faces, unmistakably female, but marked by years of isolation and unnatural feeding. Their skin was pale as birch bark, their hair long and tangled with pine needles, their eyes holding an intelligence that was human enough to recognize but alien enough to terrify. Over the following years, similar encounters were reported with increasing frequency. Hikers spoke of finding caves littered with animal bones arranged in precise patterns, the smaller bones sorted by size and the larger ones cracked open to extract marrow with surgical precision. The arrangements suggested intelligence and a systematic approach to nutrition that went far beyond simple survival instincts. More disturbing were the discoveries of small, handmade dolls found tied to tree branches throughout the high country. These crude figures crafted from pine needles and animal fur bore an unsettling resemblance to the porcelain dolls that Elias had purchased from the tinker. The locations where these talismans appeared seemed to follow a pattern, marking territories known only to their creators. Local hunting guides began to avoid certain areas, claiming that game animals had developed unnatural behaviors. Deer and elk moved in tight herds and refused to graze in valleys where the snow showed strange tracks. Predator populations had shifted dramatically, with wolves and mountain lions abandoning traditional territories for unknown reasons. But perhaps the most chilling evidence came from the discovery of what appeared to be an attempt at communication. In 1912, a Forest Service worker found a message carved into the bark of a massive pine tree, letters gouged deep enough to remain visible for years. "Mama," it read, just as it had been scratched into the cover of that battered children's book years earlier. "The hunger they were born with may still walk the mountains." Among all the evidence recovered from the Galloway homestead, one document stands apart for what it reveals about the true nature of the evil that festered in that remote canyon. Found tucked between the pages of Agatha's Bible was an unsent letter that would have changed everything had it ever reached its intended recipient. The letter was addressed to a sister whose name has been lost to history, written in Agatha's careful hand during the early years of her marriage to Elias. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible, the words chosen with the precision of someone trying to explain the inexplicable. The letter described the birth of the triplets, though Agatha referred to them not as children but as creatures whose appetites had revealed themselves from their earliest days. She wrote of attempts to feed them normal food that they rejected with violent sickness, and of the first time Elias had provided them with meat from his work. "Elias says it is the only way," she wrote, her handwriting becoming erratic. They are so hungry, always so hungry, and nothing we have tried will satisfy them except what he brings from his work. He tells me it is necessary that they will die without it, and I have seen how they waste away when the supply runs short. God forgive me, so am I. Those final 4 words, written with such force that the pen had torn through the paper, revealed the truth that investigators had missed. Agatha had not been an unwilling participant in the horror that consumed her family. She had shared in the unnatural hunger that defined their household. The letter went on to describe the gradual erosion of her humanity, the way the taste for human flesh had awakened something primitive and terrible within her. She wrote of dreams filled with the scent of cooking meat, of waking with saliva flooding her mouth at the sound of Elias returning from the ice house. Most chilling of all, she wrote of the children not as victims, but as kindred spirits who understood the same hunger that consumed her. She described sharing meals that bonded them in ways normal families could never comprehend. The triplets were not prisoners but partners in a conspiracy of appetite. The transformation was complete, she wrote near the letter's end. I no longer recognize the woman I was before coming to this place. When I see the miners walking past our home, I do not think of them as men with families and hopes and fears. I think of them as meat. The community's desire to believe in simple explanations had blinded them to the more disturbing truth. The horror that had festered in the Galloway homestead was not the result of one person's evil, but the collective embrace of hunger that stripped away every trace of human compassion. In the end, there was only one certainty that emerged from the ashes. In the Galloway house, no one had been innocent. The hunger had claimed them all, transforming parents and children alike into creatures that existed beyond the boundaries of human understanding. The mountain got what it was owed, and then some. If you've made it this far into this nightmare, consider subscribing for more stories that explore the darkest corners of human nature, because sometimes the most frightening truth is not that evil exists in the world, but that it exists within us all.